Brilliant. Well, thanks for joining everybody. First of all, in terms of house rules, we're recording today's session, but there will be Q&A at the end when you can ask questions of, well, frankly, any of us, but especially Jonathan, our special guest today. But we'll turn the recording off so that you're in a safe space and you can ask whatever you like. Today, also with a view to Eurovision, we're testing the technology. So you're joining us live from Leeds, in my case, London from Jonathan, and we're also joined by Kate, who's part of the Node4 security team. So Kate and I have worked closely together and with Jonathan in the past. Kate spent 12 years as a time-served police officer, so spent a lot of time dealing with physical crime and now in the world of cybercrime and fraud. So with no more ado, I'm going to hand you over to Jonathan Frost from Stop Scams UK. Jonathan, just to introduce yourself and maybe give us, as you're from a not-for-profit, a couple of minutes on what Stop Scams UK does and how you're trying to save the planet.
Well, thanks for the build-up, Andy, and thanks very much for the opportunity to come and contribute to this webinar today and to speak to some of your customers. Stop Scams UK is a sort of tri-sectorial collaboration, effectively. So we collaborate across three industry verticals. So tech, so Google, Microsoft, Meta, telecommunications, BT, TalkTalk, Gamma, and 3, and of course financial services. And as Andy said, we are a not-for-profit organisation, and the intention is basically to find ways for those three sectors to work together to defeat as many scams as possible. The clue is in the name of the organisation, and I'm very passionate personally about us bringing the world of cyber effectively to the issue of fraud. For too long, fraud is an issue that's been dealt with from an investigative perspective, because like Kate, I have a law enforcement background. The focus has always been on the money and where the money's gone. And as we've become effectively arrived in a situation where fraud is predominantly, if not almost exclusively, cyber-based, we need to pivot and change our tactics around that, because the offenders, the people that are launching BEC attacks on organizations or are trying to spearfish people, are effectively being ignored to all intents and purposes from an investigative perspective more often than not, because of this obsession of following the money. And just for sort of additional insight, one of the reasons why following the money doesn't work is because much as we outsource some of our IT provision to organizations or cybersecurity sort of services to companies like Node4, criminals outsource money laundering, and that effectively creates a gap between the offenders and the recipients of the cash. So in essence, we really are just interested in trying to start with the environment in which victims are most likely to find themselves, so tech, whether it be search, organic, paid content, and then erect barriers in the left to right journey with the intention of providing people with an opportunity to escape being defrauded and fundamentally preventing them from making a payment as a result of the fraud.
No, so thanks for that. A comprehensive answer. I guess one of the things as you're saying that, I kind of thinking we talk a lot about cyber because it's cool and it's sexy and it's at the James Bond end of the thing. And, we hear ransomware has taken 7 million from Colonial Pipeline. I sort of feel like fraud is like the poor relation in the debate. So if I was explaining to my mother the difference between cyber and fraud, and without talking about cyber-enabled fraud, how would you put that in one sharp sentence?
There are two forms of cyber. One that's motivated by the opportunity to make a gain, and activism to all intents and purpose. Fraud is always exclusively about financially motivated crime.
So I always think as well, when I'm trying to explain it, I think fraud is you've been tricked to a website and as you say, you've typed in your credit card details, somebody's lost some money. Whereas, the big end of cyber is, like I say, the big multi-million-dollar complicated gang ransomware stuff. I also tend to feel it's the kind of high volume, low value. So 100,000 people losing their 100 quid is what's driving fraud, as opposed to one organization losing 7 million. Is that fair, or is it wrong to put you on the spot and say what's the biggest fraud case you've seen going on out there?
I think that's very fair, and actually, I think one of the reasons why we use the word scam is because actually, we're talking about fraud or fraud crime, But the reality is that scams is actually a little bit broader than just fraud. So if you think about it from the kind of the legislator's perspective, I would say that scams spans things that fall under the Fraud Act, but also covers issues that are maybe contrary to the consumer protection regulations, etc., where people or organizations are attempting to dupe people into a subscription trap, for instance, or maybe even into contract law. And effectively, going back to the last point you made, these are all economically motivated scenarios. The intention is to invest as little money as possible in the process of executing the crime and achieve the greatest return. And that's true of someone who is spearfishing a major corporate with a view to stealing credentials versus someone who is setting up a, I don't know, driving license renewal front that they're using Google Ads to promote and duping people into signing into a subscription trap.
I mean, at the risk of this, so thanks for that. At the risk of this being a no-brainer question. So from what we've said so far, do you think that's why cyber's getting the big investment? Like, people like buying firewalls and really complicated tech, but with fraud, I kind of find it hard to buy something that stops, my mum or our staff being defrauded. Is other than protective DNS, which we're all big fans of, and those kind of things, which spans both domains. But is that also fair that I can't buy a bit of tech? I can't think what I buy to go and stop fraud, but I can think what I start to do to stop cyber. Is that one of the reasons why it's not getting the press it needs?
Well, there's a common factor in both cyber dependent risk and fraud risk, or even scams, as a broader sense, and that is humans. Effectively, we've created an environment in which humans have become the target. So to your point around cybersecurity products and services, they are designed to ensure the integrity of an environment or systems or services. The same is true of fraud. The countermeasures that have been introduced by the banks have created an environment in which it's very hard for a fraudster to perpetrate what the banks would refer to as an unauthorized fraud. So, using someone's credit card without their knowledge or hacking their online banking. So what's the natural response to that? The natural response to that, of course, is to focus on the vulnerabilities of the customer or the user. So that, I would say, is the common factor across both of those threats. It's the opportunity or the necessity from the criminal's perspective to socially engineer someone into doing something that's contrary to their own interest or the interest of the organization that they work at.
Jonathan, if I may, how do you think we get it into the psyche of corporations that actually fraud is relevant to them? So I'm thinking specifically business email compromise. The targets of those and the money they're going after can be both small and large. But would you agree that that's a method or a modus that's increasing? And businesses need to be more switched on to that, and not just thinking fraud is all about the individual. It is very much about the corporate.
Well, I completely agree with that. I mean, I think it'd be fair to say that one of the things that the pandemic did is it increased the attack surface really quite substantially. Organizations that previously had no cloud-based services within their portfolio, basically embraced those services through necessity very rapidly. I think more broadly as well, to your point, business email compromise, is that something that's increasing? But there's every evidence that absolutely yes, that continues to be a perennial problem. And I think any organization that doesn't have a focus on good controls, particularly within the financial aspects of their business, vis-a-vis those types of threats, is really, really at risk, because unfortunately people do misconfigure their cloud-based email solutions. They do forget to turn on logging, they do forget to do X, Y, Z, but at the same time there's a fascinating psychological aspect behind BEC. I mean, it's less so now, but the original sort of mega BEC events that occurred relied on the psyche and culture of organizations, whereby another name for BEC is CEO fraud. where people lower down in
whaling as opposed to fishing is the common term, isn't it?
Absolutely. People lower down in those organizations were getting that, I have to close this deal, I'm the CEO, transfer that money right now. And depending on the culture of the organization, the effectiveness of its controls, you know, organizations in France and other countries, the UK as well, they lost hundreds of millions of pounds. You know, it was really quite significant. But, you know, that's just one example. But that whole supply chain thing, I think, as well, is worth sort of highlighting. So imagine a situation in which, for instance, and this is a real world example, you're a producer of milk powder in the Netherlands. Okay, it's a pretty bizarre idea, but you suddenly get an order from Boots, or at least you think you get an order from Boots, and you basically ship £2 million worth of milk powder to the United Kingdom, some big yellow storage. That kind of obviously makes sense, doesn't it? And then you send your invoice to Boots, and guess what? Boots go, well, I didn't order £2 million worth of milk powder, and your business goes bust. I mean, these things happen day in, day out, unfortunately, whether it's someone impersonating a large vendor. So I think, you know, that whole focus on good financial controls and good controls in terms of supply chain are really, really essential when it comes to meeting both the cyber risk and the risk of financial crime.
And by control, so we're always trying to automate things in the IT industry, and some of that, I guess, is the boring stuff of two people signing off a big financial transaction, people calling people, etc. But that's all very automatable, isn't it? A lot of people seem to think stopping this stuff is going back to manual process or double checking things, but it is the boring check 1 in 5 things, double check this, triple check that kind of thing, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. But it's also about preparation, isn't it? You know, it's about everything we know about DKIM, SPF, DMARC, etc. You know, what is your DMARC policy? It's all of those things. So, you know, within a business, everyone needs to be joined up around how you're effectively going to try and minimize that risk. But I think to your point, Andy, you know, you absolutely need to make sure that you've crossed off as much as you possibly can the human component. You know,
Yeah.
don't rely on SMS-based 2FA. Get everyone security keys. You know,
Yeah,
whatever. I mean, these are small
exactly.
incremental things that can make a world of difference.
But you know, before we go on to the next question, just to share with everybody a story, I was with the Bank of England yesterday, just to name drop, and their latest scam has been somebody has put out an email saying, because we've got a king, all of the money with the Queen's head on needs to go back to the Bank of England. Please post it to this address, and we'll send you brand new money with the king's head on, and you'll get an extra 5%. And the CISO bank says suddenly their call center was people calling in saying, I've sent money to you and you haven't posted the money back. And suddenly they went, wait. So the beauty of that I like is, although we've got all this technology and we like talking about tech, the really basic thing of if I email 1 million people, I'll get 10,000 daft people who will fall for it. For me, that's the fundamental difference between fraud and cyber. You know, I'm struggling to think what technology I throw to stop people doing crazy things like that. So I shouldn't smile, but sometimes you have to hand it to criminals that they're actually really clever in a lot of cases, aren't they, to try and outwit all of us. And we've all fallen. Everybody, if I put my hand up, I've fallen victim for scams and frauds and things. It's often how you mitigate, isn't it, and realizing fast enough in those kind of cases.
Well, I mean, you know, it's an old story, but Microsoft produced a paper about email, you know, risk around cybersecurity, and they basically said, well, why do Nigerian princes claim to be Nigerian princes? And because effectively it's a method of self-selection. Now, I mean, the interesting thing, the story you've just told, if those people were told to do that by a certain channel, I don't know whether they received a letter or something like that. You know, there may well be other losers within that equation, not just the victim. You know, there may be other businesses that have lost money because the postage license was stolen or whatever. I mean, you know, in all of these scenarios, there's always more than one loser more often than not.
Yeah, no, totally. So one thing, and I know this is probably going to hit something you may have talked about in past history. So a lot of Node4's customers are big into logistics. Logistics, often you get a text that turns up that says your parcel's arrived. I've got a text this morning telling me allegedly I've been in a taxi somewhere, Lord knows where, and to click on a short link. So, I mean, what should Joe Public do when they get that random text? But I guess more importantly, if I am any of those logistics companies in the UK and people are using my name in vain, what can I as a corporate CIO do to stop that at source?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, the easiest thing you can do with a text like that is forward it to 7726, which spells spam. And each of the mobile networks provide the opportunity for you to forward that information. It's interesting the point you make around sort of brand abuse and people impersonating organizations, etc. Clearly, there are a whole range of businesses that specialize in takedown, for those types of issues. They're very well known. Interestingly enough, actually, though, one of them, there are other vendors, but one of them, Netcraft, do actually allow just anyone to report fraud through their website. And one of the things that they will often do is work with registrars rather, to take down those domains, but they'll also put it into their block lists, etc. So even without spending money, you can actually do something about it. But first and foremost, forwarding it to 7726 is really useful. But also a bit of additional background on why that actually does bring some benefit. Most people will have noticed that the volume of spam texts that they've received on their mobiles has gone down. So, our member 3, for instance, and, BT, EE, they are both organizations that have invested very heavily in the optimization of Spam Shield, which effectively is a firewall for bad SMSs. And all of those operate on the basis of pattern recognition. So one of the beneficial things that you do when you forward 7726 is you actually create an opportunity for someone like EE to go, well, that's really interesting. X number of organizations or X number of subscribers rather have forwarded me this text. It has a certain structure to it, or to your point, Andy, it has a URL in it. I can add that into Spam Shield and make sure that that campaign then effectively is mitigated. So you end up in a situation whereby the offenders, who more often than not use SIM boxes, their campaign or the duration of their campaign's validity is significantly decreased, and consequently the return on investment is also reduced.
I think that's a good point.
That's good news. Sorry, Kate. Go on.
Sorry, I was just picking up on that, and I think that's a key point. And coming from my former profession, we were often faced with what's the point in reporting it? And the thing you've highlighted, there is value in always reporting it. So whether it's a text message, whether it's a phishing email, there is somebody behind the scenes doing something that will protect us as individuals and also corporates.
But absolutely, I mean, with email, there's the suspicious email reporting service from the NCSC as well, which again, it's just a simple case of forwarding it. And actually, for that matter, and to that point, there's absolutely nothing to add to stop you as an organization adding SIRS, for instance, to Office 365. In fact, the NCSC has a guide on their website that explains to you how to effectively turn the report phishing button into something that automatically forwards it to your vendor if you have one, or just sends it to SIRS. But to your point, Kate, there is absolutely a value in reporting. I think, in fairness to everybody, one of the big challenges we've got, though, is providing people with feedback. And that would be true of 7726. It's not necessarily obvious to people that there's a value behind using it, but in reality, there is.
Yeah, there's also the marketing element as well. I mean, going back to somebody here that Andy's asked the question if anybody knew about it, the number of people that we speak to that simply don't know about it.
Yeah,
and that's the key thing.
And that's why we do these calls, just to spread the word. And talking of things people didn't know about. So this is a slinky link here. See, this is not just thrown together. Jonathan, why don't you tell us about the very little known phone number of 159? And first of all, put your hand up on the call if you've heard of 159, because you're about to. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
I'm just waiting to see if anyone put their hand up.
No, definitely.
Oh,
there we go. One person.
Well, there
Excellent.
you go. This is opportunity. So everyone's familiar with our most famous 3-digit number, which is obviously 999, which is for emergencies. But obviously there are a raft, there are other 3-digit numbers that, particularly 111 obviously became very well known during the pandemic, because it was one of the ways you could seek assistance if you were unfortunate enough to become infected with COVID. 159, it sort of joins those services to all intents and purpose, but it has a specific purpose, which is when you are in receipt of a call, an unexpected call from a financial institution, and you want to safely contact that financial institution in order to verify the claim that was made to you, or just because you actually don't want to start the conversation, you know, from a cold call from someone who claims to be from your bank, which is a pretty sensible thing to do. And effectively, rather than create a situation in which people have to go off and look for the number, or, you know, where there are some, you know, marginal risks in terms of people finding the wrong number, but because of search engine optimization, etc., we came up with 159. So in fact, actually, you know, Andy's being modest here, but I'm gonna, you know, give him a bit of a throw here. Andy originally was talking about 109 for cybercrime, as we've been talking about cybercrime here, and another good colleague of ours who's actually just left Lloyds Banking Group, Brian Dilley, was put on the spot in a committee and came up with 555. Now, it actually wasn't by design, but effectively we ended up with 159, which you could argue combines those two concepts. But in essence, from any mobile phone or landline, you can call 159 to be connected to your bank in a situation where you think you are effectively under attack from a fraudster, and it covers the majority of banks. At a personal account level, we've got about 97% of the current account market in terms of coverage. Cooperative, Barclays, all the usual names that you can imagine, and you dial the number, select your bank, you get put through straight away to the financial institution in question. So at a kind of more sort of community level, if you like, if you wanted to give a message to people in your family about how they could prepare themselves for the potential that they are going to be subject to a bank impersonation fraud, and just for context as well, going back to some of our earlier points around the phishing scenario, more often than not, the vector, if you like, for bank impersonation fraud is someone completing one of those courier forms, or, you know, a phishing event to all intents and purpose. Thinking about how to prepare yourself for it, well, the key message is, you know, mum, dad, you know, younger people also are equally as vulnerable to these types of scams. Don't enter into a conversation with a financial institution that rings you up out of the blue. Absolutely use maybe the in-app secure call function, the in-app messaging function as an alternative, or failing that, zero tech required. Say to the person, really sorry, not going to interact with you because I don't know who you are. Put the phone down, use a different phone, or even pick that one up, because actually this legacy issue with the line being held open is largely, if not 100%, eliminated. Dial 159, select the bank, and get securely back to someone who's going to be able to help you. If it was a genuine call from that bank, no bank is ever going to complain if you know, sort of break off inbound contact through voice. It isn't going to happen. In fact, if anything, they would probably applaud you for your diligence.
So tell your friends, especially tell your granny and your mum and your dad, as Jonathan said, it's low tech, and but it is a brutal way of breaking that conversation. As Jonathan said, we've seen live examples of this, of where somebody puts the phone down, they then pick the phone up, the criminal plays a recording of a dial tone, and they just say ring ring at the other end, and it's actually the same criminal with a slightly different voice who's picked the phone up. So yeah, it's amazing, one of these things. So today you've learned about 7726 and 159. So I'm conscious we've got 5 minutes, then I want to throw it open to the floor, and if there aren't any questions, we'll just keep on asking questions. But I mean, for me, Jonathan, the perfect way of getting to a wrap in the next 5 minutes is, what are the 3 things you would do if you were Joe Public to stop falling for fraud? And if you're a company, what are the 2 things you do to stop your staff falling for fraud? But before we do that one, imagine if you're Royal Mail or Arrow XL or Hermes or whatever they're called this week. So I know you've told me about something in the past, that we all get these random texts and they always have a mobile number, but there's actually a way of it saying Royal Mail or Arrow XL or Node4. That, for me, that seems like quite a good one. So if I was a CIO, how do I do that? Or are there holes in that as well?
I'll go with that last point first. So that's called an alpha tag. And actually, the good news is that the UK does already have a mitigation to the problem of alpha tag spoofing. if you as an organization wanted to, so Node4 wants to send out messages that are Node4 branded, you have to go to an aggregator. They will allow you to have that tag, and they will validate that you're entitled to use it. But what they'll also do is they'll put it in the SMS registry, which prevents other people using the same tag from a different aggregator, if that makes sense.
So it's the equivalent of a trademark that only we get to use it.
Kind of. I mean, the actual purpose of the SMS registry is to prevent a situation in which a rogue aggregator might allow someone to send messages under HSBC, for instance, because in the past, they've then slotted into the thread on the phone. And so the people have found it very difficult to distinguish between the legitimate message from HSBC and the fraudster's message. Going back to your earlier point, 3 things that everyone can do. Well, I mean, the first one is prepare. Never make the assumption that you're too smart to be caught out, because actually vulnerability within the context of fraud and cyber risk, a lot of it's circumstantial. You would be surprised how many people who are significantly switched on, very capable, have high levels of capacity, etc., but for whatever reasons find themselves in a set of circumstances that cause them to fall for a particular form of social engineering. Illness, bereavement, stress, just being busy, all of those things.
End of the tax year, end of the quarter, end of the monthly salary run, all those things where we just build stress up on a Friday for no reason.
100%. Colleagues in the Netherlands, for instance, they held a big event around tech support fraud. The classic scenario, whereby everyone says, well, the only people that fall for that are old people that, get the phone call from someone who says they're from Microsoft and let them into their computer. They made the smart move of actually putting a 32-year-old guy on the stage who had just had a child. So, there was that life-changing moment created a gap in his cognitive security, for want of a better phrase. But anyway, we digress. So number 1, prepare. And then following on for that theme for prepare, absolutely think about, well, how can I make, my circumstances, my personal circumstances more robust? So, we've talked about from a prepare perspective, well, not being willing to enter into conversations, off the back of a cold call, but other simple things, lots of people have thankfully switched on 2FA. Great. It has certain merit to it. Is everyone in your family using 2FA? Become an exponent for 2FA, but actually go a little bit further as well. Don't rely on SMS for 2FA if you can avoid it. One of the things that I've always thought is a really great idea, particularly for older users of technology, are FIDO keys, so security keys that you can put into a USB slot, because actually everyone understands how to use a key. Everyone knows that if you're prompted by a service to say, well, you need to authenticate, can you put your key in? Everyone can do that. It removes some of the complexity and the frustration that people have with authentication apps and Face ID and all of that sort of jazz.
Don't get me started on USB-C versus normal USB and that one. There's a classic. I can't plug normal USB into my laptop, so you get away from that. But there's a classic. We've moved on in technology and left the other technology behind. But well, yeah, your point's well made, though.
Thankfully, you can get USB-C FIDO keys pretty inexpensively as well now. But so I would definitely, prepare, think about how you can increase your overall resilience to these types of issues. Use services like 7726, obviously, all of the usual stuff around antivirus. And absolutely, again, don't underestimate the importance of things like email. Again, if you look at a lot of consumer-based frauds, people can be, skulking around in the back of email accounts that you don't think are particularly important for months, just waiting for that email to come in from a solicitor about a conveyancing event, etc. It's really easy for someone, once they've gained access to your email, to create rules that mean that you don't see security warnings, or that, the original version of the message goes into a folder. This is not complex stuff.
To that point, a mate of mine ran a hotel business. Some of you heard the story before. He was hacked. I could tell he was hacked. Phoned up his PA. Yes, we've hacked. Yes, we're sorting things out. Please do these 2 basic things, one of which is demark, which Jonathan's mentioned. 9 months later, somebody did a wire transfer or sent him an invoice. They changed the sort code and account number. He paid it, the bank emailed him to say, "Are you sure?" But because the criminal was listening into his email traffic, they emailed back to the bank authorizing the transaction, and he lost 50,000 euros. But more importantly, the transaction didn't turn up. And your point about 2FA, MFA, again, a lady I know lost 26,000. Somebody pretended to be the bank. They'd actually used the same CLI as the bank, so it appeared on her phone as name of bank. You shall remain nameless today. She was daft enough, however. They said, "This is your bank doing a security test. Please read out the 6-digit number we just sent you." Now, of course, the text says, "Do not share this number with anyone, including your bank." She did it 6 times, and of course, it was for holiday fraud. So it's one of those things where no matter what technology we throw at it, it's really being on your game. I think a little bit healthy paranoia, I guess, is where we get to with this. I hate to say we all need to be a little bit more paranoid, but I think the more we talk about these stories, the more we start to realize that any of us can be had. I
Absolutely.
nearly gave my sort code and account number to somebody yesterday who's helping me sort out my insurance, and I said to him, "Just email me my insurance policy, and I'll call you back and do this policy number." Hasn't happened yet. He still sounds genuine, so I'm still out at court with that one as far as I'm concerned. So I'll close that one down by tomorrow. But yeah, I feel like I've nearly fallen victim for it myself this week. So it's just so easy, isn't it? So be on your guard.
If I may, actually, this feeds very nicely into a question that's come in, which is why have we witnessed such an increased influx of fraud, emails, texts, and online banking, etc., taking place in the last few weeks and months? And as a follow-up to that, how are modern-day solutions not stopping this from taking place? And I think you've touched on some of that. So there are obviously some things you're talking about there, Jonathan. But also there is the human element, and that is the vulnerable side, isn't it? But is there anything else you can add to that?
Well, yeah, there is, sadly. Funnily enough, actually, yesterday I met with the New Zealand Banking Association, and we were talking about obviously the environment in the UK, which increasingly banks are reimbursing both authorised and unauthorised fraud. Now, obviously, within the context of what we've discussed in this meeting, a lot of what we've talked about, so the payment that's misdirected is classified as authorised fraud. Now, that actually is the consequence of something that we did with the best of intentions in this country, which is introduce faster payments. So, faster payments have been fantastic for business. I mean, none of us want to wait 3 days for money to go from one bank account to another. But the reality of the situation is they've also been a significant opportunity for criminals, both from the perspective that, you can obviously get people to make the payments really quickly and you as a criminal know that the money's arrived, but also in terms of laundering it and dispersing the money. So to the question, why have we seen this massive ramp up, really, in the sense of people being targeted through a variety of channels, whether it be email, over the phone or text message? The simple reality is that the returns at the moment are really quite significant. Now, going back to our sort of Nigerian prince kind of concept, the other thing that's really beneficial from the criminal's perspective is that actually the cost of mounting a campaign, of basically reaching out to 100,000 people on the assumption that only 1,000 will respond, is de minimis. So actually, why not? And people self-select. So you've got someone who's, what is the 1,000 out of the 100,000? You've got a reasonable level of confidence that that person is going to engage with you. To take that kind of parallel again to tech support fraud, that I'm calling from Microsoft, your computer's got a virus. Let's think about the way that has evolved over the years. Originally it started as a cold call. We've all had those calls, but guess what? The conversion rate's crap. It's really not very good. Now, yes, it doesn't cost them much to make the phone call, but to all intents and purposes, for every 1,000 people they phone, 999 will probably hang up. So what's the consequence of that? Well, you try and find more intelligent ways of doing it. You do search engine optimization for support for Epson printers. You send people emails. You send people text messages. You actually use automated dialers to ring up and say that you're from Amazon, and if you don't press 1, you're going to get charged for Prime. All of this tech is so inexpensive, it's all so easy to use from a fraudster's perspective, that actually you don't have to do much to get a decent return.
And I think now that AI's out there, using AI to scan my LinkedIn to phone up and ask me something that is known allegedly to me, even though it's out there in a public profile, starts to become so easy, doesn't it? So
Well,
I'm
you know,
conscious we
Andy,
should.
on that point, I'm really glad you brought that up, because the bad news is that actually generative AI in particular is going to revolutionize the opportunity for fraudsters to do test and learn.
Yeah.
So if you think about the opportunity for someone to identify kind of like a rigid control in a financial services environment, if you've got a machine that's going to go off and try and circumvent those rigid controls for you at little or no cost, then that gives you the opportunity of basically then pitching your fraudulent activity at a level where it won't be detected. So the bad news is that if we think that we're currently suffering a tsunami of scams, it would be my inference that as generative AI in particular becomes less expensive, that we effectively will find out that the tsunami was really just a bit of a spring tide,
Yeah.
which is, I'm afraid, bad news. But the reality of it is it justifies the need to prepare even more.
At the risk of being vain, after this call, I'm going to ask ChatGPT what it knows about me, because if it knows about me, then the bad people know about me.